What would you do if the family that promised to take you in placed you not in a guest room, nor even in a plain back bedroom, but in the narrowest cell of the servants' quarters, behind a door with no lock and a window no wider than a hand? What would you do if that same wall, the one against which you laid your head each night, began to knock back? This is the story of Mary Reed, 19 years old and lately orphaned, sent to Hartwell Manor as a dependent with nothing but a single trunk and a black mourning shawl, and given a room the housekeeper called quite suitable, and everyone else called forgotten. But what waited on the other side of her plaster wall would rewrite every quiet cruelty done to her. Stay close. Settle in. And let us know where in the world you are listening from tonight. The carriage that brought Mary Reed to Hartwell Manor left her at the tradesman's gate, not the drive, not the wide sweep of gravel beneath the beeches, but the narrow side lane where the coal was tipped, and the laundry cart came at dawn. The driver did not help her down. He touched his cap, muttered something about the road back to the village, and turned the horses before the wheels had even settled. She stood a moment with her trunk at her feet. Rain had fallen earlier, and the world smelled of wet stone and wet moss. Hartwell rose above the hedges the way she remembered it from childhood visits, only larger now, and colder, and turned somehow against her. Its long gray face of dressed limestone, its rows of leaded windows, its two chimneys smoking thinly into a sky the color of pewter. As a girl, she had come here with her father in summer, when the lawns were mown to a stripe, and her aunt had kissed the top of her head. Her father was 3 months in the churchyard now. Her aunt had written a short letter, a single page, offering her the shelter of the house. There had been no mention of terms. There had been no mention of the tradesman's gate. She lifted the trunk by its rope handle and began the long walk around the kitchen garden wall. A boy in a leather apron passed her without looking up. A woman shaking a rag from an upper window drew it in when she saw Mary approach. By the time she reached the scullery door, the housekeeper was already waiting on the step, keys ringing softly at her belt. "You are the Reed girl," she said. "I am," Mary answered. The housekeeper's name was Mrs. Pell, and her mouth was the shape mouths take when they have practiced disapproval for many years. She looked Mary over from bonnet to hem, saw the mended cuff, saw the good black wool worn thin at the elbow, and gave a small nod that decided everything. "Your aunt is not receiving. You will come with me." Mary followed. Through the scullery, past the copper and the salt barrel, along a stone-flagged passage that grew narrower the further it went. The servants' hall was warm and full of steam and voices that fell quiet as she passed. No one greeted her. A tall footman held a door and let it close a breath too soon behind her. Then up a back stair whose treads were worn into shallow bowls, and along a corridor lit only by a single tallow candle in a bracket, and to the last door on the left. Mrs. Pell opened it without ceremony. "Quite suitable," she said. The room was perhaps 8 feet by 10. Whitewashed plaster gone yellow with damp. A narrow iron bedstead. A washstand with a chipped basin. A single high window, barred on the outside by wrought iron, no wider than a hand. There was no fireplace. The floorboards had shrunk and left pale gaps between them. The far wall, the long wall, the wall behind the bed, was newer plaster than the others, smoother and colder to the eye, as though it had been done in a hurry a long time ago, and then left. "Supper is at 7 in the servants' hall," Mrs. Pell said. "You will take your meals there. My mistress does not wish to be troubled with visits above stairs. That is the arrangement." Mary set her trunk down at the foot of the bed. She said nothing. Silence was the only currency she still possessed, and she was learning to spend it carefully. Mrs. Pell waited a moment, perhaps for gratitude, perhaps for tears, and when neither came, she withdrew and closed the door. Mary stood in the middle of the small, cold room and listened to her own breathing. She untied her bonnet. She laid it on the washstand. She sat on the edge of the iron bed and looked at the long, smooth wall opposite. And something in the plainness of it, the deliberate blankness of it, caught at the back of her mind like a thorn on a sleeve. It was too smooth. It was too flat. It did not match the other 3 walls in that room, or any other wall she had ever slept beside in this house. She did not know it yet, but she had been placed, quite deliberately, against the only wall in Hartwell Manor that anyone in the family had ever cared to hide. Was it kindness that put her there, or something colder? Was that smooth wall an accident of old repair, or a door someone had trusted no one would ever try? And who in that great gray house knew and had chosen not to say? If this tale has already caught you, take a moment to leave a comment and subscribe so more stories like Mary's find their way to you. Then settle back, because on her very first night beneath that plaster, the knocking began. It came first as a single sound, so faint she thought she had imagined it. She had blown out the tallow stub Mrs. Pell had left on the washstand and lain down in her shift beneath the thin gray blanket, and she was staring at the ceiling counting the joists to keep from crying, when she heard it. A dull knock. Wood on wood or knuckle on stone, muffled by something thick. It came from behind her head, from the smooth wall. Mary lay very still. She held her breath the way a child holds a breath under water, waiting for the sound to prove itself. It came again. 2 soft knocks, then a pause, then one. Not the settling of old timber, not the tick of cooling plaster. A rhythm, a deliberate hand. She sat up slowly. Her feet found the cold boards. She turned on the mattress and set her palm flat against the smooth wall. And the wall was colder than the other walls, colder than the night air, cold as a coin left out in frost. She waited. Nothing came for a long minute. Then once, so faint she almost lost it in the beating of her own blood, another knock, right beneath her hand. Mary drew her hand back. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and told herself it was rats. It was rats in the wainscot. It was pipes. It was the house shifting in its old bones. She told herself these things the way a person tells herself stories to hold sleep at bay. When at last she lay down again, she lay with her back to the smooth wall and her face to the room, and she did not close her eyes for a long while. Morning came pale and grudging through the barred window. She dressed in her mended black wool, drew her hair back, and went down the worn stair to the servants' hall, where the smell of porridge and bacon fat hung heavy and the fire had been up since 5. 6 or 7 of them were already at the long deal table. Mrs. Pell sat at the head. A place had been laid at the very foot, on the bench, next to no one. The talk did not stop when Mary came in, but it changed. It thinned. It slid sideways into low half-sentences that were meant to be heard and meant to be denied. A red-cheeked kitchen maid glanced at her over a spoon and glanced away. A younger housemaid, no older than Mary herself, leaned to another and whispered behind her hand. "Read, girl," the whisper said. "Aunt won't have her upstairs. Not a farthing to her name. Fancy black, fancy manners, sleeps in the corner cell. That room, aye." Mary sat. She lifted her spoon. She ate her porridge without lifting her eyes. And the porridge was thick and salted and warm. and she was grateful for it. And she let no part of that gratitude show on her face. She had learned in the month since the churchyard that a face which shows nothing gives nothing to be taken. The tall footman who had let the door close on her heel the day before poured tea into her cup without meeting her eye. Mrs. Pell watched from the head of the table and did not intervene and did not need to. The whispering did her work for her. It was as Mary was carrying her bowl to the scullery that she passed the old man. He sat by the hearth on a low stool, cleaning boots. He was thin and stooped, and his hair was the color of tallow, and his hands, though gnarled, still moved with the patient economy of a life spent at small tasks. She had not seen him the night before. Someone called him Old Barrow in passing and did not speak to him further. He was the sort of servant kept on out of habit long past his usefulness, mended in the corner like a chair no one had the heart to burn. He looked up as she went by. His eyes were very clear and very gray. He looked at her longer than a servant should look at a lady, and longer than a stranger should look at a girl. And then he spoke, quietly, so only she could hear. "Mind what listens back, miss?" Mary stopped. She half turned. She thought she had misheard him. He was already bent again to the boot in his lap, drawing a black rag across the toe in slow, even strokes, and he did not look up again. She stood a moment, waiting for him to say more, and when he did not, she went on into the scullery with her bowl held tight between her hands. She did not know what he meant. She would not know for weeks. She was crossing the flagged passage back toward the stair when the second voice found her. This one carried. This one meant to carry. "So this is the charity." He was standing in the doorway to the boot room in riding breeches and a good tweed coat, tapping a crop against the side of his boot. He was perhaps 25, fair, pink about the jaw, with the loose, easy smile of a man who has never in his life been contradicted. Mary had seen him once as a boy on the lawn at Hartwell, some cousin of her aunt's late husband, brought in to sit near the inheritance the way a magpie sits near bright things. She could not have named him then. She learned, from Mrs. Pell's stiffening beside her, that his name was Mr. Ridley, and that he had the run of the house. "Short Reed's girl," he said, looking her up and down with the same easy smile. "In from the parish, are we? Come to see what can be salvaged." Mary did not answer. "Nothing to say. Well, a quiet mouse is a tidy mouse." He laughed, a small pleased laugh, and turned to Mrs. Pell. "Keep her out of the drawing-rooms, Pell. My aunt has enough to grieve without paupers underfoot." "She is in the back passage-room, sir," said Mrs. Pell. "Ah." His smile widened. "The cell, very good, very suitable." He looked at Mary again. "Do try not to steal the spoons, cousin." He went past her with the crop still tapping. The smell of his coat, wet wool and horse, hung in the passage after he was gone. Mary stood a long moment with her hand on the newel of the back stair. She did not weep. She did not answer. She climbed the stair and closed the door of her small cold room behind her, and set her back against the smooth wall, and breathed until her hands were steady again. Below, somewhere in the house, she heard him laughing. That was Tuesday. By Wednesday evening, the whisper in the servants' hall had settled into a shape. The Reed girl was penniless. The Reed girl was proud. The Reed girl slept in the corner cell because her aunt could not stand the sight of her, and it was only a matter of weeks before she would be found a place in some parish school or married off cheaply to a curate. They laughed a little, quietly, over their tea. They did not laugh cruelly. They laughed the way people laugh when a small, easy verdict has been passed, and no one need think again. Mary heard them, She said nothing. She ate. She climbed the stair. She closed her door. And every night, when the tallow was blown out, she lay in the dark and waited for the wall to speak. It did. Not every night, and never on any pattern she could hold. Sometimes it was the same soft rhythm as before. 2 knocks and 1. Sometimes it was a slow scrape. A long single sound, as of something heavy shifted an inch across a floor and set down. Sometimes it was a silence so pointed she began to feel that silence itself was a sound, that the wall was holding its breath the way she held hers. She did not tell anyone. She did not know whom she could tell. Mrs. Pell would call it fancy. The kitchen maids would call it fancy and add it to the whisper. Mr. Ridley would smile his small, easy smile. Her aunt was not receiving, so Mary listened alone. The room grew familiar to her in the way small, cold rooms grow familiar to those with no other. She learned which board creaked under her heel and stepped around it. She learned that the barred window, at the very brightest hour of the afternoon, admitted a single narrow beam of pale sun that reached exactly to the foot of the iron bed and no further. She learned that the plaster of the 3 ordinary walls, when tapped with a knuckle, gave back the flat, dull sound of solid lath. And she learned, on the 3rd night, sitting up in her shift with her ear against the smooth wall, that the smooth wall did not. The smooth wall gave back a hollow, not the hollow of an empty room, the hollow of a space packed with something soft and dense, something layered, something that returned the sound of her knock a beat late and half a note lower, as if the wall were not a wall at all, but a lid. She sat back on her heels. Rain had begun again outside, a fine, steady rain that ran along the eaves and pattered on the barred glass. The tallow stub guttered on the washstand. Her breath came white. She was cold and hungry in a small way she had grown used to, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and inside her chest something quiet and stubborn began to stand up. She did not yet know what was on the other side of that wall. She only knew, with the certainty of a girl who had once stood at her father's grave, and understood that the world was not going to be kind, that there was something there, something the family had put behind plaster, something the family had trusted no one would try. Mary lay down that night with her hand flat against the cold, smooth surface, and she fell asleep at last with her palm on it, listening the way one listens for a heartbeat under a coat. Outside, the rain kept on. Somewhere far below, a door closed, and behind the plaster, once, very softly, something answered her hand. She woke to a thin gray dawn and the smell of coal smoke rising through the boards from some kitchen fire 2 floors below. Her hand was still on the wall. She lay for a long moment before she moved, feeling the cold plaster take back its shape under her palm, and then she sat up and looked at it in the plain light of morning. In daylight, it seemed only a wall again, smooth, whitewashed, yellowed at the corners where damp had reached. She dressed, made the bed, and went down to porridge and to the whispers that no longer surprised her. But that afternoon, when she came back to change a torn stocking, the narrow beam of pale sun was in the room. It came through the barred glass at its brightest slant and lay across the floorboards and touched exactly the foot of the iron bed. Mary knelt on the boards to reach her mending basket, and as she knelt, the beam ran past her shoulder and struck the skirting behind the bed frame at an angle she had never given it before. Something in the wood caught the light and threw it back. She stopped. She set the basket aside. She pulled the bed a hand's breadth from the wall, quietly, so no one in the passage would hear the iron feet scrape, and she bent her head down to the skirting where the smooth wall met the ordinary wall in the corner. There, cut into the pine at the height of her knee, no larger than a thumbnail, were 3 small letters and a date. The letters were plain block capitals, done with a knife point by someone unhurried. J.R., and under them, in the same hand, the year of her birth. Mary knelt on the cold boards and did not breathe for a count of 10. J.R. was her father. Her father as a young man, before he had married, before he had been anyone's father, before he had been buried in the churchyard 3 months back, with a plain stone and a low wall of yew. She knew his hand in a knife cut the way she would have known his hand in ink. He had carved his initials into the skirting of this room in the year she was born. He had knelt where she was kneeling now, and put his mark on the wood behind the smooth wall. He had known this room. He had been in it. He had cared enough about what stood behind that plaster to sign the timber beside it in the year his daughter came into the world. She sat back on her heels and looked at the letters until the beam of sun moved on and the little cut initials went dim again. Somewhere below, she heard Mrs. Pell's keys ring along a passage. Somewhere farther below, Mr. Ridley laughed at something in a voice pitched to be overheard. Mary put the bed back against the wall with the same care she had drawn it out, smoothed the thin gray blanket, and knelt for her mending basket, as if she had come up only for that. She said nothing at supper. She said nothing to old Barrow when she passed him at the hearth. She only looked at him once, and he looked back once, and bent again to his black rag. That night the wall was silent. Mary lay awake anyway, her hand where it had been the night before, and she understood that she would have to know. Not guess, not suspect. No, and she understood, with the same quiet clarity, that a girl in a mended dress who slept in the corner cell could not go asking after strong rooms and old carpentry in a house where her aunt would not receive her. She would have to earn the run of the passages some other way. In the morning, she went down early and asked Mrs. Pell for work. Mrs. Pell looked up from the linen press and let her eyes travel over Mary's face for a long moment before she spoke. "You are not staff," she said. "I know it," said Mary. "You are your aunt's blood. I would rather not be idle." Mrs. Pell's mouth tightened at one corner. Whether in disapproval or in something closer to respect, Mary could not tell. She was set that morning to the silver in the pantry, and after the silver to the mending basket in the sewing room, and after the mending to the dusting of the long, cold corridor above the library, that no one used, and no one had cared to open the shutters of since Michaelmas. The work was steady, quiet, and without ceremony. It kept her out of the drawing rooms, which pleased Mr. Ridley when he passed her on the stair and said only, "Very good, cousin, very suitable," without slowing his step. It also let her walk the house. She learned it in inches, by cloth and by hand. She learned which corridors ran above which. She learned that the servants' passage on her floor ran along the eastern side of the manor above the old library and the estate office, and, at its farthest end, where her cell was, above a windowless room on the ground floor, that no door in any passage seemed to open. She learned that the map of the house in her head did not close. There was a space of about 8 feet by 10, set into the eastern wall of the manor on the ground floor and directly beneath her room, that had no door on any side she could find. An aging tabby cat began to keep her company. He was a thin marmalade tom with one torn ear and a habit of walking the servants' passages after dark. He had been, old Barrow said in passing, the pantry cat since before the mistress married. Mary found him one night sitting outside her cell door with his tail tucked over his paws, as if he had been waiting some time. She let him in. He walked the room once, sniffed at the smooth wall for a long moment with his ears forward, and settled at the foot of her bed. After that, he came most nights. She called him nothing. She only put her hand between his ears when he pressed against her knee, and he stayed. Her hands learned the house before her mind did. Dusting the library shelves she found, tucked flat behind a run of unread sermons, an old estate plan drawn in brown ink and folded to the size of a prayer book. She did not take it. She only opened it enough to see that the eastern wall of the manor, on the ground floor, held a small, square chamber marked in a neat hand simply as the strong room. Mending a torn valance in the sewing room, she overheard Mrs. Pell tell a kitchen maid, without knowing Mary was behind the screen, that the mistress had not been down to the eastern passage since the master died, that no one had, that the key to that door had been given to Mr. Ridley to keep, and that Mr. Ridley kept it on a ring at his waistcoat. Scrubbing the flags of the boot room on her knees, she saw a workman's crayon mark on the underside of a door lintel, a small numeral and a date. In the same year her father had cut his initials into her skirting. Her hands were reddening. Her back ached at night. The cat slept curled against her ribs, and every scrap of what she gathered in silence, and set beside the sound of that hollow wall, and did not yet let herself say aloud what all of it, laid together, had begun to spell. It spelled a room the family had walled up and then walked away from, and then, because of some small piece of business or dread or thrift, forgotten how to open. A room her father had known and had marked, a room the housekeeper would not name and the mistress would not approach, and the cousin kept a key, too, at his waistcoat. Mary let herself, at last, on the 5th night after she had found the crayon mark, sit up in the dark with her hand pressed to the smooth wall and think it through to the end. She waited for a night when the house was heavy with sleep. It came on a Sunday after a long, wet day, when the kitchen fire had been damped early and Mrs. Pell had gone to her own room with a headache and Mr. Ridley had ridden out and come back drunk and slept where he fell in the small library. The cat came in at 10 and settled at the foot of the bed, as though he had understood the arrangement. Mary rose in her shift with a shawl over her shoulders. She took the tallow stub and the flint from the washstand. She had learned from mending the valance, where the sewing shears lived. From the boot room she had taken that morning a short iron file with a cracked wooden handle nobody would miss. She pulled the iron bed away from the smooth wall a full arm's length, more than she had ever dared, and knelt on the cold boards with the tallow low and steady in a saucer beside her knee. She began at the skirting where her father had cut his initials. She worked the file into the seam between the pine and the plaster, and drew it up an inch and down an inch, listening. It grated at first. Then it slid. The seam was not a seam. It was a joint. Someone had set a strip of molding over it and painted the molding to match. She lifted the strip away in her fingers, whole and light, and it came off in her hand like a shed skin. Behind it was not plaster. Behind it was a plank of pine, planed smooth, whitewashed on her side and darker on its other, set into a rebaited frame. The frame was hinged. She saw the hinges only when the tallow flame bent sideways in a draft that came, cold and slow and dry, from a place inside the wall. Her breath went white before her face. The cat lifted his head. She worked the file into the crack at the hinge side, and then, when she understood it, into the crack at the opposite side. And she found what she should have looked for first. A small wooden peg driven flush, holding a simple wooden latch. She drew the peg with the point of the shears. She lifted the latch. The panel gave a half-inch and stopped, held by nothing but the weight of its own long stillness, and she took it in both hands and eased it open. Cold came out. Cold and the smell of old paper, of iron, of beeswax gone hard, of a room that had breathed no other breath for a long time. She lifted the tallow. The light went in pieces. First a slate floor, swept clean once and never swept again. Then a low iron door set into the far wall. The outside of it, the plain, unornamented back of it, no handle, no plate, only the flat of it. Then, ranged along the near wall on shelves of plain deal, tin boxes with numbers painted on their lids in the same neat hand as the estate plan. Then a small square table. Then, on the table, a japanned box no larger than a Bible, with a brass plate on its lid. She stepped through. The cat came with her, tail low, ears forward, walking along the edge of the tallow's light. The brass plate said, in engraved script, "Read." Nothing else. Just her name. She stood a long moment before she trusted her hand to lift the lid. Inside were papers folded in threes, ribboned in faded green tape, and on the top of them a letter in her father's writing, addressed to her by the name he had used for her as a small child. Beneath the letter were deeds. Beneath the deeds, a will, signed and witnessed, dated 2 months before her birth. Beneath the will, a small canvas bag, heavy for its size, tied at the neck with waxed cord. She did not read them there. She knew, kneeling on the slate with the tallow trembling, what she was holding. Her father had not come to Hartwell in her childhood as a guest. He had come as an owner. The strong room was not her aunt's. The strong room held his portion, set aside for her, sealed the year she was born, hidden behind a plastered panel in what was afterwards made a servant's cell, so that the girl who might one day come looking would sleep against it, and never guess she was sleeping against her own inheritance. She understood, finally, why she had been put in this room and no other. Not to hide her from the family, to bury her with the thing they had buried. She took the japanned box, closed the panel, drew the molding back into its seam, pushed the iron bed against the wall, and sat on the bed in the dark, with the box on her lap and her hand on the cat's back, until her breath came even. She did not sleep. Toward dawn she began, in her head, to plan. She kept the box under the loose board beneath the washstand where the floor had shrunk. She hid the letter, folded small, inside the lining of her bonnet. She wrote nothing down. She went to porridge in the servants' hall as she had every morning, kept her eyes on her bowl, and when Mrs. Pell asked her to turn out the linen press, turned out the linen press. She had meant to walk into the village that afternoon and find the solicitor whose name was on the will. She did not get the chance. At noon, Mr. Ridley came into the sewing room with the crop under his arm and stood a long moment in the doorway watching her thread a needle. He was not smiling in the easy way. He was smiling in the other way, the pink about the jaw gone a shade deeper, the eyes still. "Cousin," he said, "you have been busy." Mary did not lift her head. "Mending, sir." "So Mrs. Pell tells me." He walked to the table and set the crop across the linen, and dusting, and scrubbing, and walking the eastern passage, as I was asked, and moving furniture. She kept the needle steady. She said nothing. "There is a mark," he said pleasantly, "on the floor of your room. A scrape. The bed has been shifted. Mrs. Pell noticed. She mentioned it to me. I swept beneath it." "Did you?" He picked up the crop again and tapped it once against the edge of the table. "Cousin, I will speak plainly. My aunt is unwell. She is not to be troubled. Anything found in this house belongs to my aunt, and after her to those she names. A charity girl in a mended dress does not go poking behind the plaster of a room she was given out of pity. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, sir." "Good. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, quite softly, "You will keep to your room tonight. The door will be locked from the passage. In the morning we will speak again, you and I and Mrs. Pell, and we will settle what is to become of you. I think a place in a parish school. I think that suits." He went out. Mary heard the crop against his boot down the whole length of the passage. She sat still until her hands were steady. Then she rose, went up the back stair, and found the door of her cell already fitted in the last hour, with a hasp and a padlock on the passage side that had not been there at breakfast. The padlock hung open on the hasp, waiting for nightfall. She went in. She closed the door. She sat on the bed. She had, she reckoned, until dark. She thought first of the box beneath the washstand and the letter in her bonnet. She thought next of Mr. Ridley's face and the sound of the crop. She thought last and longest of her aunt, who had written her a single page offering shelter and then had not received her, and who Mrs. Pell said had not been down to the eastern passage since the master died. Her aunt was unwell. Her aunt had grieved a husband. Her aunt, Mary suddenly understood, might not know what stood in her nephew's hand at his waistcoat, or what stood behind the plaster in the corner cell, or that the girl in the mended dress downstairs had a name on a brass plate 2 floors below her bed. Mary took the letter out of her bonnet. She took the will out of the japanned box. She wrapped them together in a square of clean linen from the sewing basket she had carried up. She put the bonnet on. She put the shawl over her shoulders. She waited until the light at the barred window was the color of pewter, and the house below had gone to its early supper, and then she opened the door of her cell, the padlock was still open on the hasp, and walked, without hurrying and without stopping, along the servants' passage, down the back stair, along the corridor above the library, through the green baize door that separated the servants' side from the family side, and up the wide carpeted stair that she had not climbed since she was 7 years old. She had never been permitted above stairs at Hartwell. She went above stairs now. She met no one. Mrs. Pell was at her tea. Mr. Ridley was in the small library with a decanter. The house had the hush of a house at its lowest hour. At the end of the long upper landing was a white door with a china handle, and behind it, she knew from a child's memory of a summer visit, was her aunt's sitting room. She knocked once. She waited. A voice inside, thin and tired, said, "Come." Mary opened the door. Her aunt sat by a low coal fire in a black shawl, not unlike Mary's own, thinner in the face than Mary remembered. Her hair gone almost white at the temples, a book open on her lap that she had not been reading. She looked up. For a long moment she did not know the girl in the doorway. Then she did. Mary crossed the room, knelt on the hearthrug beside the chair as she had knelt beside the tallow the night before, and laid the linen bundle, unopened, on her aunt's knee. "Aunt," she said, "I think you should read these. I think no one has shown them to you." Behind her, far below, in the small library, a decanter set down on wood, and a chair scraped, and a man's voice called for a lamp. Her aunt did not speak for a long minute. She looked down at the linen square on her knee as if it might vanish if she moved. Then, with hands that shook only a little, she untied the corner and drew out the folded pages. Mary watched her read her husband's brother's hand, Mary's father's hand, across the top of the will, and saw the small, quick shudder pass through her aunt's shoulders when she reached the date and the name of the witness. "I was told," her aunt said, "that there was nothing." She said it once, quietly, to the fire. "There was this," Mary said. Her aunt read the letter next. It was not long. Mary knew already what it said, having read it by tallow light in the corner cell in the small hours. That her father, on the eve of a journey he had not been certain of surviving, had lodged his portion in the strong room of the eastern wall, set it aside in her name, and asked his brother to keep the key until Mary came of age. Her aunt read to the end, folded the page along its old creases, and pressed it flat against her knee with the flat of her hand, as if to keep it from lifting. Downstairs, the chair scraped again, and a boot struck a step, and Mr. Ridley's voice came up the stair calling for Mrs. Pell. Her aunt looked up. Something in her face that had been asleep for a long season woke. "Ring the bell, child," she said. Mary rose and pulled the worked cord beside the mantel. Somewhere below, deep in the servants' passage, a bell answered in its wire. Mrs. Pell came first, apron straight, keys still at her belt, and stopped in the doorway when she saw Mary on the hearthrug beside the mistress's chair, with a paper in the mistress's hand. Mr. Ridley came behind her with a lamp he had not needed to fetch himself. He stopped, too. He looked at the paper. He looked at Mary. The pink went out of his jaw. "Aunt," he began, "the girl has been—" "Sit down," her aunt said. He did not sit. He set the lamp on the small table by the door and stood with his hand still on it, as if he had forgotten it was there. Her aunt held up the will so the firelight caught the seal. "This is my husband's brother's hand. This is his signature. This is the witness of the rector who buried him. Did you know of it?" Mr. Ridley did not answer at once. Then he said, "There were papers. I understood them to be unclear." "They are quite clear," her aunt said. "Send for Mr. Holbrook in the morning. First light. The gig if the roads are foul." Mrs. Pell said, "Yes, ma'am," and did not look at Mr. Ridley as she went. Mr. Holbrook came before breakfast. He was a spare, careful man in a black coat, the family solicitor from the village, and he had known Mary's father as a young man. He read the will in the sitting room, with his spectacles low on his nose while Mary stood at the window and her aunt sat by the cold grate. He read it twice. He set it down. He said, quietly and without flourish, that the document was in order, that the deeds attached to it were in order, that the strong room named in the schedule appeared to be the very chamber the estate plans described, and that Miss Reed, as sole named heir, was in possession of the portion set aside for her the year of her birth. He inclined his head to Mary once, gravely, and said, "Your father, miss, was a careful man." Mary said only, "Thank you, sir." By that afternoon, 2 men from the village came up with tools, and the plastered panel in the corner cell was opened properly, and the low iron door in the far wall of the strong room was found to answer to the key Mr. Ridley took from his waistcoat and laid, without a word, on the table. The tin boxes were counted. The canvas bag was weighed. Nothing was missing that the schedule had named. Mr. Ridley was not turned out. Her aunt would not have it. He was told, quietly, in the sitting room, that he would go to the northern property that had been his mother's, and that he would not be received again at Hartwell without her aunt's written leave. He bowed to his aunt. He did not look at Mary as he passed her in the passage with his valise, but he stopped in the doorway of the boot room and said, low, "Cousin," and Mary said, "Cousin," and that was the whole of it. The village learned within the week. The laundry cart carried it down the lane before the solicitor's gig had reached the crossroads. The tall footman who had let the door close on Mary's heel held it open now, a beat too long, and colored under his collar. The kitchen maids who had whispered at the deal table rose when she entered the servants' hall and did not know where to look. Mrs. Pell said, "Miss Reed," and meant it. In the market square on Saturday, the women at the stalls fell quiet as she passed, and then, one by one, inclined their heads. It was not celebration. It was the slow, careful redrawing of a name. Old Barrow was at the hearth with his black rag when she came down that evening. He looked up once, clear gray eyes steady, and said, "You minded, miss?" Mary said, "I did." He bent again to the boot. That was all that passed between them, and it was enough. A month later, at the end of a long, soft afternoon in early spring, Mary walked out through the kitchen garden gate and down the lane to the churchyard where her father lay. The hedgerows were breaking into green. The sun was low, and the light on the limestone of Hartwell behind her was the color of honey. She carried no flowers. She had never been one for flowers. The marmalade cat, who had followed her as far as the yew wall, sat on the top stone and watched her go in. She stood a long while at the plain stone with its low wall of yew. She did not speak aloud. When she turned to go back, she stopped at the gate and looked up the lane at the long gray face of the manor, its rows of leaded windows catching the last of the sun, the two chimneys smoking thinly into a sky gone pale gold at its lower edge. Her aunt was at the sitting-room window. She lifted a hand. Mary lifted hers. She walked back up the lane in her mended black wool with her hands in the pockets of her shawl. At the kitchen garden wall, she stopped and set her palm flat against the warm stone, as she had once set it against the cold plaster of the corner cell, and stood a moment with her eyes closed. "I was not left," she said quietly, to no one and to the house. "I was only kept." She went inside. The cat came down from the wall and followed her in. Thank you for staying to the end of this quiet story, for sitting with Mary through the cold room, the hollow wall, and the slow, patient work of being seen. If her long walk toward belonging moved you, a like, a comment, or a subscribe helps more stories like it find their way. Stay close. There is another door waiting to be opened next.